So I'd like to welcome you to this third seminar in our series, The Emergence of Trans, Retheorizing Gender and Sexuality. And today's focus is on trans in popular representation, and I want to extend a warm welcome to our speakers, Del LaGrace Volcano, Kat Gupta, and Lee Gale. For those of you who've looked on our website, and we've handed out just a description of this series, we set this up to promote a cross-disciplinary conversation about gender and sexuality in the wake of the emergence of trans, and trans as a standalone terminology, and what it might represent. And we set up this series of around four questions. And these were, firstly, to what degree does trans reconfigure everyday lives, herald new normativities, and suggest what Lindsay and I, between ourselves and our own research, have been thinking of as possibly a post-closet epistemology? How does the emergence of trans challenge, develop, or extend dominant understandings of gender and sexuality? How do trans lives and new discourses of trans articulate with issues of rights, discrimination and citizenship, health and welfare, education and popular common sense? And also, what challenges do trans identities and trans discourses present for clinical and therapeutic practice, for gender and sexuality theory, and for everyday articulations of identity and intersubjective and communal connection? And I think there's been a kind of emergent argument so far in the series, and that is that the emergence of trans has challenged not only dominant, but also some key counter-discursive understandings of gender and sexuality, and it's done so in three interesting ways. The emergence of trans seems to have ruptured identity-led understandings of gender and sexuality. And coexisting with identity discourses are also feeling-led understandings. And this is really, that argument is partly, was emergent in research that Lindsay and I have been doing based on Lindsay's primary research on a project under a different title, but the emergence of trans unexpectedly came up, and it came up in that way, that if we have a feeling-led rather than an identity-led understanding of gender and sexuality, how does that change the gender and sexual field? So that seems to be something that is emergent and coexisting with more recognizably identity-orientated discussions and understandings of gender and sexuality. There's also a rupture of a presumption that there must be a suture between gender and sexuality, whether that's defined by identity or by feelings, that there's some kind of necessary suture between how people feel about gender and how people feel about sexuality. And of course, there's a growing popular repertoire of trans in representation, in language, and in debate. And I just want to very briefly say what happened in the first two seminars. The first seminar that we did, which we called Trans Genealogies, we considered trans repertoires and identifications in the context of clinical and therapeutic contexts. And we covered a range of themes, including narratives of authenticity that guide clinical protocols, psychotherapeutic approaches, and patient self-identifications. We discussed issues surrounding pathways of care in terms of interventions and management of trans bodies, professional discourses, educational, diagnostic, etc., clinical and practice protocols vis-a-vis patient and client experiences. And we also considered alternative therapeutic discourses and the trans self-health context. In our second seminar, we discussed, which we called Trans in Everyday Culture, we focused on social networks and social movements and everyday social practices. And in that context, a number of themes emerged, including everyday languages of trans, web-mediated socialities, rights and citizenship issues, and perhaps, at least for me, most interestingly, a kind of paradoxical articulation between genderqueer and gender-orientated trans discourses and sensibilities. And that was perhaps one of the most interesting coexistences, was that there were two distinctive modes of trans discussion, one very much orientated within gender and one described as genderqueer. So in this third seminar, we're turning to the question of trans in popular representation. And there are really four starting questions we had in setting this up, and they are: what is the popular culture of trans, and how can we trace its emergence? How important has media been to the emergence of the multi-stranded social movements of trans, and in what ways? What are the political and aesthetic dimensions of trans in popular representation? And where do we find trans representations? And what are the emergent conventions of trans narrative, trans genres, and trans modes of signification or meaning making? And from my own perspective on this, I'm personally interested in media ecologies, both in terms of my teaching, but also in terms of the various types of research that I've done. And over the past few years, particularly facilitated by digital technology and the iPad in particular, I've been engaging in a pretty extensive form of media immersion. And these have been on a number of themes: cancer, genes, genetics, gender culture and popular media, politics, and political melancholia. So I kind of put myself at the center of an intersecting set of media fields to see what's going on in all of these areas. And while I haven't done a rigorous analysis of trans, I have been keeping note of how trans emerges in these different contexts that I have been exploring. And one of the things I've come to think about this is that trans really is a kind of articulation of what might be termed a number of micro media ecologies, including but not limited to art and photography, television and film, and particularly a proliferation of upload culture in trans-related visual media. If you go onto YouTube and look up trans, for example, there's quite a proliferation of upload media culture, web activism, and my primary interest, reportage. So I'm more familiar, I think, with the reportage end of it because that just happens to be what I'm interested in. So there's a growing repertoire of trans-related themes across media and across genres. And trans is an increasingly prominent strand in its own right, to the degree that trans is one of the categories on The Guardian. It's an umbrella under which a lot of reportage has happened. And indeed, if you go on to sort of aggregation sites like Zeit, you can put trans in and it will aggregate it on that topic, which suggests that it's like a kind of out there topic that's recognized as a point of articulation. So I find that very interesting, just sort of thinking about how does something move into being a recognized popular cultural umbrella under which so much can be aggregated, and what are the terms of those representations that get aggregated there. I'm interested in media, and I have been so throughout really my career for a number of reasons, but one of the main ones is that I believe that media articulates with material life in multiple ways. And in the trans context, we can see that media articulates by providing representations, but also modes of social connection, community building, and social networking, particularly with new media and digital technology. Media is also important. Transmedia becomes a big constituent of the cultural imaginary of gender and sexuality. It reflects, and I think it's also catalyzing, changing public discourses concerning gender and sexuality more widely, And it's clearly interfacing with material lives on the terrain of law and social policies, and that's been very evident in reportage of late. The dominant mode of reportage that I've been encountering is associating trans-related issues with social justice issues, about rights in schools, about bullying, about rights concerning your birth certificate, and announcements of different kinds of changes in social policy. One of the recent announcements was that there was a trans prom queen in California. So it's been interesting to me where certain discourses come up, and reportage is the place where that interface with material life has been emergent as part of the cultural imaginary. And finally, the last thing I want to say is just from my perception, the emergence of trans has been part of and also has itself catalyzed a wider trend in the public domain of what might be generalized as a social liberalization of sexualities. And this is not just in terms of a liberalization arguably embedded in new laws about civil partnerships and gay marriage, but a corollary trend toward a paradigm of sexual fluidity. And to my interest, in yesterday's Guardian, there was a survey of sexualities that's recently been done. I can't remember who did it. But the title of it was about the new sexual fluidity. So that's actually a terminology that's been taken up in a fairly conventional social liberal inclined site. So I think that this discourse of sexual and gender fluidity has been catalyzed by and reflected in the emergence of trans. And this is something that Lindsay and I have been talking about in our work together. If the Kinsey revolution suggested that sexual identities were complex on a continuum of possible resolutions, the emergence of trans possibly heralds what might be termed a post-Kinsey or an after-Kinsey revolution, one in which fluidity coexists with, or in some instances replaces, linearity, in which gender and sexuality represent intersecting spectra, not only of possibilities, but of actual lived experience, in which gender and sexual feeling does not necessarily resolve into identities as such, and in which the subjective alignments of body and feeling play out on a field of expectation that is defined by what might be termed a productive uncertainty. So I'm going to leave it there, just by way of introduction to why we thought this was an important topic to have as a standalone, dedicated seminar. And I'm going to turn the space over to Lindsay to take us to our next bit.